I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And as Colette mentioned, it feels a bit like I'm in a bunker because it's so grey outside. Normally it's quite nice and bright in here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Macon-Verzé, which is a wine that's very close to my heart. It's a wine I've worked with in my almost all of, well, 3/4 of my 20 plus years at C&B. So Domaine Leflaive, I think, should be fairly well known to most people. It's arguably one of the greatest white wine estates in the whole of the world, really, and certainly in Burgundy, it's one of the top 2 or 3 as well, as you'd expect. They're based, the Leflaive family, of which there's a few different branches, but they are based in Puligny-Montrachet, which is not a bad place to be based if you're very much after making some of the world's best Chardonnay. And it's interesting because the Domaine has amazing holdings in Puligny-Montrachet, from Montrachet, Chevalier, Bâtard, Bienvenue, Bâtard, to an amazing array of Premier Crus, etc. But what I think makes the Macon-Verzé so interesting is that it was really through their desire to expand and to have a little bit more production that they came up with this wine. So the Macon is about an hour or so drive south of Puligny-Montrachet, and what they wanted to do was to be able to expand their production, but with all of the same attention to detail and care that they were making with the wines in Puligny-Montrachet, where in fact they actually vinify the Macon-Verzé. So it's really a brilliant value introduction to Domaine Leflaive. I think is the best way to look at that. And it was kind of the brainchild of Anne-Claude Leflaive, who very, very sadly died back in 2015. And the estate is now run by Brice de la Morandière, who was her nephew, and also had, from around about between 2015 and 2016, a new winemaker in Pierre Vincent, who's worked very closely with Brice, and we're delighted to represent Macon-Verzé exclusively in the UK and to be Domaine Leflaive's primary agent in the UK and sole agent in Singapore as well, which is a brilliant thing to have for us. So that kind of introduces a little bit about Domaine Leflaive themselves. So the Macon and Macon-Verzé specifically is something we often describe as, and I think it was Adam Brett Smith, our MD, who came up with it, but as the least expensive fine wine in the world. Now, at £30, I'll leave you to decide whether that's fine wine or not in a way, but what he means by that is it is this access point into the great Chardonnays of Domaine Leflaive. And 2004 was the very first vintage. And in fact, I had a bottle not that long ago of the 2004, and it's, not that there's an intention that you keep this wine 15, 16 years. It's actually perfect, I think, in the sort of 2 to 6 year bracket, and age is well beyond that, but that's when it's at its prime. The 2004 is still lovely. It's made biodynamically, as all the wines at Domaine Leflaive are, and this can be lazily called sort of organic with knobs on, but basically it means that everything you do in the vineyard is about the whole ecosystem and about making everything as sustainable as possible. So that is something that they do in the Macon in every way that they do in Puligny as well. And that's quite a big investment in terms of the effort that you have to put in. So they've done that all the way along. Now this is the 2016, which is interesting for a number of reasons, really. 2016 was the last vintage in which they actually included 6 separate plots, so 6 separate vineyard plots from within Macon-Verzé. 2 of them now, Les Chênes and Les Montes, from 2017 onwards, are actually made as slightly as separate wines. So you get the added bonus with the 16 of it being the last vintage where all of those, including the very best parcels, were included, which is grand. And so there's that. It was also an extraordinarily strange vintage in terms of the weather, insofar as the budding, which is, if you like, the grapes first appearing, and flowering as well happened very early, a little bit like we've had in 2020, which I might mention a little bit later. But it budded very, very early. And then they had an absolute nightmare scenario, which is that around about the 25th of April, they had a lot of rain. That in itself, not a problem so early in the growing season. But then overnight, it went completely cloudless and very cold. And there was a savage frost in Burgundy. It was not so bad in the Mâcon, a little bit further south, of course, but in Puligny, it ravaged some of the vineyards as much as 80 to 90%. And some people didn't make certain wines for this very reason. So there's that. Interestingly, well, not interesting, tragically, it happened in Bordeaux on exactly the same sort of date in 2017. So it's one of those parts of nature. But anyway, to come on to the 2016 Macon-Verzé, I absolutely love this one. I love this wine now because it's generous. It's quite full without being rich. It's absolutely fine to drink it on its own, which is how I have to. I think almost all wine deserves to be drunk at least a glass or two without food, because I think they should always stack up on their own. But it has a lovely length about it. It has a tiny bit of toastiness on the nose, although there's very little new oak used, which I think is another thing makes it so nice and drinkable early on. And then you get a little bit of that sort of lemon and honey, a little bit of spice, and there is a slight nuttiness, but it's more, without being too Julie Goulden, it's all a little bit more macadamia and cashew nut. It's kind of white, sort of more bleachy nuts that are less strong, if you like, less toasty, and it just leaves you with a lovely finish. I wouldn't, as with white Burgundy, I think it's a really good idea to chill it, but I think this, and maybe will think the same with the Fleurie, are both wines that profit from being cool rather than cold. And I would certainly bring the Macon-Verzé out of the fridge for 20 minutes or half an hour if you can, before. And certainly if you've had it in the fridge all day and you get back and you really fancy a glass of the least expensive fine wine in the world, then get it out of the fridge and just leave it out of the fridge, anything up to an hour or hour and a half, because you just get more and more flavor and more aroma from it as you go along. So that is Macon-Verzé 2016 from Domaine Leflaive, a wine that's a real staple in our portfolio and our selection, but an absolute star as well, and a wine we do a little bit in magnums too, which are always great fun. So there we go, and I will pass you over to Will.
I'm showing you this wine here this evening, which is by a domaine called Lathuiliere Gravallon, based in Beaujolais, and Fleurie is really, really, really close to Mâcon, as Will said. It's, if you get the map out, you can, they're like within 50 odd miles or so of each other. It's quite a nice route to go down from there, actually. Beaujolais generally is being drunk by the French for years and years and years and years, and it's only beginning to really get more trendy over here, especially with young French people back at home, because it's good value compared to Burgundy or the Rhone Valley, which is further south of it. But it's beginning to take off a lot more. What I love about Beaujolais as well is because you're pretty much between Burgundy and the Northern Rhone, you're sandwiched just between the two of them. You get some styles which you immediately think, oh, this could be a Côte-Rôtie, or this could be in that sort of style, and then you get some like lighter, fresher, more Pinot-like styles. So you get that really good sort of difference and sort of dip between different crus and areas. There's it's divided into 10 different crus. This one here is a Fleurie, but there's Moulin-à-Vosne you might have heard of. There's these guys also make a Brouilly, a Morgon, a Cherouble. But Fleurie generally is one of the probably more familiar names. I think partly because the name Fleurie is quite representative of maybe the style of wine that it is, quite flower-like. But that's actually not why it is called a Fleurie. It goes back, like a lot of vineyards do, to Roman times. There was a Roman general called Floricum in the area, and that's why the region is called Fleurie. There's a little history fact for anyone who want to know. It always helps me remember things as well if I can put a name to it. Right, so the main grape, what makes Beaujolais different, I think, to pretty much any other region is, one of the things, is that the main grape is called Gamay. As opposed to Pinot Noir in the north or Syrah further south, Gamay is really the spiritual home for Beaujolais. You can get a little bit in Burgundy too, and you can also get a little bit in the Loire Valley, but most of the time you'll see it, it'll be down in Beaujolais. It's quite similar to Pinot, you know, it looks similar, it tastes a little bit similar, and it was actually grown a lot more in Burgundy going sort of 100+ years ago. They actually it was almost 50-50, but they decided to go down the single varietal route in Burgundy, and just everything got basically replanted as Pinot Noir. So they sort of moved Gamay further down south, and now it's sort of found its place in Beaujolais. You tend to be like red fruited, very uplifting, very fresh sort of styles of wine. Anyway, onto the Domaine. They're a really small Domaine, only about 15 hectares. Husband and wife team, Kathy and Cedric. They, you know, as I said, make wines all over Beaujolais. This is one of their smallest crews. It's only 1.9 hectares. And they only produce about, on average, 13,000 bottles a year of it. So it's pretty small production in the grand scheme of things. They are a family Domaine, pretty traditional in terms of how they do things. This is the 5th generation. So they've been making wine here for a good while now. And they tend to be, just like the Mâcon that Will was talking about, they try as hard as they can be to be organic, and they follow those sorts of principles. They don't use any sort of chemicals they don't treat their vines with any chemicals or anything like that, which is a good thing. I often like try and relate it to, you know, how your diet would be. If you eat organic and healthily, then you are going to be a healthier person. It's exactly the same with grapes and wine. It's got to be as in sync with nature, I think, to make the best possible wine. So I would advise anyone, if they're looking to buy stuff, always check if they follow certain principles. You know, if they follow biodynamics, organic farming, it's always a good sign. AKA a bit more eco-friendly, I think. This is hand harvested, which is painstaking, but definitely worth doing, because you get a much better idea for what grapes are going into the final blend. And then when it gets into the cellar, they do this thing in Beaujolais. It's quite famous for having that bubblegummy, kirshy sort of thing in the lower end, and that's because of a process called carbonic maceration. These guys don't do that, but they do a little bit of semi-carbonic maceration, which basically means they pump a little bit of carbon into it, which kind of lifts up the grape a bit, because Gamay can actually also be quite tough and rigid. So if they do a little bit of this, it really opens it up and makes it a bit more floral, a bit more fresh. They don't go the whole hog like you would do, you know, with Beaujolais Nouveau, which got it pretty much matte, but there's a little bit of it in there just to brighten it and lift it up a little bit. So after it's been through that process, which usually lasts a couple of days, they put it into old oak to smoothen it out for 12 to 18 months. And then after that, it's pretty much ready to bottle, and you can almost drink it from the off. But, you know, this is the 2018 now, and that's really, really lovely, as it is at the moment. I mean, is it Domaine? It's pretty, as I said, it's traditional earlier. The vines are on average 50 years old, which is pretty decent going for Beaujolais, and at the price point it is. You know, that adds a lot of complexity. And going back to the vineyard, they also do this quite interesting thing where they grow grass down the middle of each vine. And what that does is it cuts into the ground, and they have these little grass roots basically make the vine roots have to go deeper and deeper and deeper into the soil. So they get into that pink granite, which is the soil in the area. Most of Beaujolais is granite soil. And what that does is it gets more minerality and structure into the actual body and end product of the wine, because the roots have to work harder for it. They get more concentrated grapes. So it's a little tactic that they've basically picked up and realized what works best with those guys over the years. But generally, everything's done on sort of a micro scale here, which is what I love. It means that, you know, the end product of the wine is going to be you know, they care a lot about it, basically. Anyway, on to the wine. Beaujolais is one of those interesting ones. It's really unique in style. I always think it's got a lot of red cherry fruit on the nose. You could almost mistake it, you know, for like an Italian wine in that respect. But then when you taste it on the palate, it's really crunchy fruit, like cranberries, always spring to mind. Because they've done a bit of that semi-carbonic maceration, it lifts it up a bit. Not bubblegummy whatsoever, but you've definitely got that nice lifted, fresh rose petal feel to it. And generally, that's what you're after when you're going into this region, I think. This is £13.50 a bottle. You want to basically drink it straight away off the shelf. Goes really well with pretty much any food by itself. I know Will was talking about earlier what they do with white, the Macon, how you want to leave it for an hour and a half to sort of warm up a bit. I put this in the fridge about 2.5 hours ago, left it in the fridge for an hour and a half, then had it out for about 45 minutes, and it's perfect now.
Yeah.
A lot of people drink white wine far too cold and red wine far too warm. I always like to try and balance it in the middle, and actually, you know, you can almost drink them at more or less the same temperature, unless it's sort of Sauvignon Blanc for a fiver from Tesco or something, where you want it cold so you can't really taste it. But generally, yeah, that's pretty much all there is for now. I can tell you about this wine. It's perfect out the bottle. I'll tell you a little bit about the vintage. It's 2018, which around most of France for red wines is a very, very good year. If you think back to 2018 in the summer when the Football World Cup was on and everyone was outside drinking in the pubs, it was baking in France. I was actually in Lyon in the Rhone Valley in the summer of 2018, and it was so warm. So with red grapes, often that just makes them really attractive and juicy and fresh. So red Burgundy, red Beaujolais, red Rhone, they're all quite powerful, juicy wines which you can drink pretty early, but they'll be very, very good wines, and it's definitely one of the vintages that will be remembered. Louis Raisonné is basically where you want to follow. You're not if you want to be organic, you've got to be certified, and you've actually got to be very, very strict at following, you know, organic principles. Louis Raisonné is basically a nod towards becoming one day an organic producer. So you get, you know, these guys, firstly, they need to make a livelihood. So they need to produce wine every single vintage. So if there's really bad weather one year or something attacks the vineyards, they could, if they wanted to, use something to protect the grapes from it, which is a really practical way of doing it. And, you know, you've got to respect that. So it's basically just a nod towards organic farming, and it's the first step you would make towards being organic one day, I think. Firstly, by itself, it's good, especially a little bit cool. Poultry, poultry is really good with it. Duck's very good with it. Game, if you want to as well. If you like prefer eating fish, it goes very well with like a red mullet or sea trout, cooked salmon. And then if you're vegetarian, it would go well with, you know, a lot of pasta dishes, you know, Italian pasta dishes. It could sort of match the acidity of like rich tomatoes and all of that sort of stuff. Really flexible.
Vintage variation, there will be, yes, there will be. I think it's quite a steady continental part of France in terms of the region. So you will find probably less variability in these wines than you might find in the Rhone to the south, because of because they get the sort of the Mistral and they can get extreme temperatures, and in say Chablis to the north, where again they can get more extreme sort of cold. So I would say that the vintages nowadays, and obviously a lot is changing with this, I think there is vintage variation, and I think the winemakers will always look to roll with the vintages rather than to fight against them and make a totally consistent style. They like the idea of richer vintages and fresher vintages, but within the sort of tracks of a relatively consistent style, I think. So that there will be characteristic differences. I mean, I would drink the 16 and probably in time the 18 of the Macon-Verze maybe before the 17, because the 17 has a lot of zip and is quite focused and will age very well, but not in a crazy way. But I mean, the weather, very quickly, I meant to mention this earlier, is changing rapidly. The Burgundy at the moment is very different weather from what we've got, and actually at somewhere like Dongeville in Volnay, they have just, or 2 days ago, finished picking their 2020 vintage. And previously, that date was the record of their earliest start they'd ever made. So things are changing, but early or late doesn't necessarily mean good or bad quality. It just means that's when things have happened.
Yeah. Generally, I think the quality of wine being produced right now has never been so high, and they've got all the tools in there, you know. They've got all the tools to produce a good wine pretty much every vintage. There's different weathers and there's different problems. And, you know, since 2010, yes, there's often amazing vintages, but especially the last sort of 4 years, you've seen pretty consistent quality of wine. You just might get a slight hint of something a bit lighter or something. You know, the last few vintages have been so hot that pretty much red wine in particular has been able to thrive quite a lot. We shall see what happens in the future.
Right. So the other two wines, Will's going to say a little bit about the red, but there's the Tarnish Estate Riesling 2018, which is brilliant. They've been going 11 generations. The latest 3 generations, all women, and Sophia, who runs it now, will be passing over to her daughter Christina. They're based right on the banks of the Mosel. Estate Riesling, it's an estate Kabinett, is the sort of equivalent, if you were to do a Burgundy equivalent, to Bourgogne Blanc. So it's their entry-level wine, 100% Riesling, just off dry, but I don't want people to be put off by that in any way, shape or form. And it just drinks brilliantly. Incredibly great as an aperitif, but also with anything with a bit of spice. I think Clive, who does a lot of Facebook Live things with us, did some crab linguine last week. That's out. I mean, for lunch for me is absolute heaven. So I think, yeah, it's a cracking wine. And I think even if you have misconceptions about Riesling or think Riesling sweet or whatever, absolutely give it a crack. It's really good, and you can have a glass a day for 5 or 6 days. The wines are really resilient as well. I think people think because they're focused that they aren't. Absolutely the opposite. They'd be better on day 2 and 3.
Yeah.
Enjoy.
And the other wine is Chateau Barrio de Blanc, which we call in-house Barry White. It's a Corny and Barry exclusivity from the Moex family down in the right bank of Bordeaux. We've been working with it since the early 2000s. Absolutely like a staple in pretty much any of my colleagues. It's this wine. It's 70% Merlot, 30% Cabernet Franc, Claret. Well, right bank Bordeaux. It's from St-Emilion as well, which I should mention. It's right bank Bordeaux, which is just not fussy at all, at a really good price. Goes really well with steak haché or literally any meat-orientated dish. Is brilliant with, or by itself. You can age it for 10 years if you've got the patience. We're drinking the 2016 though right now. This is the vintage we've got on offer. Couldn't recommend it anymore. It's $23.95 a bottle for Grand-Pré St-Emilion. That's pretty hard to beat, I think.
Yeah,